Hello class, this is Professor Allen, and here is lecture day 18 of Early Western Civilization. And we're going to be picking up with the five good emperors, which we of course left off last time on last Thursday's class. And who are these guys? Well, we've already covered three of them, right? And began with the fourth. We covered Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, and some of Antoninus Pius's rule last time in class, and we're going to finish Antoninus Pius today, as well as cover Marcus Aurelius, and Marcus Aurelius' immediate successor, and then a few successors after him, before it kind of starts breaking down leadership-wise in the empire, and then after that we end up having a very large crisis, and then after that, and those multiple years of emergencies and issues of horrible leadership, or rather some cases no leadership across the empire, we end up getting another person that comes to power, and he kind of solves those issues, and we're going to cover his reign as well, and what immediately happens after his reign. And so, of course, the five good emperors were all known for being chosen by adoption, other than Nerva. He, of course, came to power after the elimination of his previous, the previous emperor that he was an advisor to, right? Which he had a hand in. But all of the others were all chosen for their merit or leadership capabilities, because they were all good leaders one way or another, either it being military-wise or policy-wise when it comes to other issues that a country might need to have, handled. And so all of these emperors do a very good job at ruling. However, as you may see, the map of the empire, which stretches all the way from this red northern line here in Britain, all the way along the Rhine River here, eventually meeting the Danube River in around the same area, stretching along here, and then now using this as a border, the Black Sea as a border, present-day Turkey, or Asia Minor as it was called back then, and then even stretching into former Parthia, down into Syria, present-day Syria and Palestine area, and Israel area, into Egypt, along this line in North Africa, back up to Spain, into Gaul, and basically everything below those borders and internal of those borders. The empire's a massive amount of territory. And for one person to cover it, no matter how good they are, and to be able to lead over it, is a undertaking that is almost impossible. And under these five good emperors, they begin to start realizing this. And it's going to take a few other people to kind of come along to cause people later on to realize, no, ruling the empire as one person is really impossible. Okay? You've got to have a lot of people under you doing a lot of jobs, of the jobs and the day-to-day business, which a lot of it was happening anyway. But at this point, it even becomes obvious that even the bigger stuff, it's too much for one person to handle all of it. And so you'll end up seeing a change from where there being one emperor to multiple emperors at the same time today. That's a bit of a spoiler. And so, of course, let's go back to Antoninus Pius right here and his reign, which was, of course, from 138 to 161 CE. And so we've already covered that he was adopted by the previous emperor Hadrian, and that he was normal and social-minded, which is kind of a big difference from previous guys, other than the five good emperors. For the most part, they were relatively normal. He had set up orphanages for children, and of course also trust funds for dowries for orphan girls, so they could, eventually get married, right? As we covered last time, on the last couple seconds of class. And so he kind of did a little bit of touring the empire, but not that much. He kind of stayed in one place for the most part during his reign. And even though he never visited Britain itself, he did have plenty of maps, and he realized that Hadrian's Wall, built by his predecessor, which had begun construction in 122 CE, or AD as it says here, CE equals AD, remember? And so he knew that would defend southern Britain, where the Romans in Britain were living, but some of them had started venturing out into this area at that point, some of the Romans, as well as he also realized that one wall getting constantly attacked is, able to be defended, but it would be great if we could end up actually extending out and have kind of like an early warning system. So he ordered a building of a second wall out here called the Antonine Wall, where it's very thin right here, as opposed to the very long, wide gap here, from, basically sea to sea, Irish Sea to the North Sea, even though they had different names back then. He basically decided to have it built here after looking at maps. And so it began construction in 142 CE. It, however, wasn't really a wall like the big castle wall kind of style that the Hadrians Wall was. This was much different. This one had a stone foundation, so they basically used bricks or stone or concrete to basically lay out like a flat length along the distance, and then they kind of made like a big giant levee on top. It was mostly mud and turf, kind of very similar to our levee system in this area of South Louisiana, where it was basically just kind of a mini hill. And so it was kind of mud at first, and then they put turf or grass over top of it to stop erosion, right? But, the stone foundation would keep it in relatively one place. And they would kind of have the stone foundation on either side as well to also stop with the erosion as much. And so it took 12 years to build this, actually. Even though it was a much smaller endeavor compared to Hadrian's Wall, it still took 12 years to build. And it was 39 miles long and about 10 feet high. And not very impressive compared to Hadrian's Wall, which is this massive, castle-style wall, right? As we had pictures last time. There were 16 small little forts along it for the troops. And so it wasn't as impressive. And actually, they only defended it for about 8 years after it was finished building. So it took 12 years to build, and then they only ended up defending it for about 8 years after that. So it really wasn't really well done. Basically, soon after Antoninus Pius dies, they kind of retreat off of it and go back to Hadrian's Wall. They realized that it was just probably a bit too far north, and that there was too many tribes still living in these areas, as well as too many there, that it just wasn't able to be defended as well. As well as, some of the tribes over here were just kind of sailing round to here and going this way. Over across the rest of the Irish Sea had a little bit more choppy waters, so it was a bit more dangerous for ships to travel, but they could travel a shorter distance like this area. Antoninus Pius ends up eventually having his daughter marry a young man named Marcus Aurelius, and Marcus Aurelius would be later adopted by Antoninus Pius, or soon after the marriage, to his daughter. And so Marcus Aurelius is adopted by Antoninus Pius, and Antoninus Pius basically says, okay, you're going to be the next emperor. And he ends up actually living to, Antoninus Pius himself lives to 74 years old, and ends up getting extremely, extremely sick in the last about year of his life. He ended up having to have basically needing crutches to be able to stand for long periods of time. Age was just beginning to become a factor at 74 years old. And then later on his last couple days alive, he became very, very sick himself. Where he basically was constantly, it looked like it was some kind of food poisoning or some other kind of just illness, fever or something. And so he passed away. And, of course, Marcus Aurelius becomes emperor. Now, Marcus Aurelius actually became emperor with another young man named Lucius Verus, okay? Lucius Verus is typically forgotten about, and in fact, Antoninus Pius also adopted Lucius Verus. He actually had decided that he was going to adopt two people, just in case one of them ended up dying, and it was going to be Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus. And the two of them got on relatively well. They had a couple ideas, difference-wise on how to run things, but the two of them realized, okay, you do your thing on that part of the empire, I'm going to do my thing on this side of the empire, and then we'll swap around every now and then, going to where's needed. And so Marcus Aurelius begins ruling in 161, as well as Lucius Verus, and Marcus Aurelius would continue ruling until 180 CE. However, Lucius Verus would only rule for 8 years total, along with Marcus Aurelius, because Lucius Verus would actually die prematurely, possibly either from plague or some other kind of illness, in about 169 CE. And so Lucius Verus passes away, and Marcus Aurelius is in charge. And so we end up having Marcus Aurelius now as emperor from 169 to 180. And, that kind of co-ruling is kind of going to be looked at later on again. Just remember that the two of them co-ruled, and they were able to co-rule peacefully. Again, they didn't necessarily always get on, but it didn't come to, civil war or anything like that. It never came to fighting or big arguments or anything like that. They were just like, okay, you do that, and I'll do this over here, kind of thing, at times. Marcus Aurelius, as well as Lucius Verus, while he was alive beforehand, had to put down several rebellions. There was rebellions up in Britain against some of the tribes that were south of the Hadrians Wall. There was also issues in Spain, where some of the people that were in Spain decided to rebel, as well as in Egypt. And so Lucius Verus at first was dealing with some of those issues, and then Marcus Aurelius had to continue with those issues. Marcus Aurelius, during his rule by himself, also started touring along the Danube River, which, if we go back to the bigger map, it's, this region. You can kind of see there's the Danube River here, around Dacia and near the Black Sea. It empties out into the Black Sea. And so we end up actually having Marcus Aurelius kind of traveling to that area, and there's a period of time known as the Danube Wars, where it's multiple wars and multiple conflicts against many, many different tribes living along the Danube River. Eventually, he decides that it's just going to keep on happening. It's just going to constantly happen. There's never going to be an end to these wars unless he comes up with some way to make a peace treaty or some kind of way to make the barbarians, as they were called, on the other side of the river, listen to him and listen to the Roman government and have some kind of long-term settlement. So what he ends up doing is he ends up basically speaking with some of the tribal leaders, has other ambassadors go and do that for him, and he ends up making these barbarians, or friendly barbarians, some of them were, the Federati, as they become known as, the Federati, or Foederati, depending on how you want to pronounce it, which kind of translates to federates, which is kind of friends, in a way. Kind of, where they would actually live on the border along the river, on kind of both sides of the river, straddling the river in some cases, some on one side and some on the other side, and that in any other time, other tribes that were not deemed as federates and giving this foederati status came near the border or near these areas where these federati groups lived, that the Federati, as well as the Roman military, would fight together against these other barbarians. And so it was kind of these lands were given along the river around this area here. And this ended up working out very well because these Federati would fight to protect their new land that they were given. And so they were allowed to live on and defend, live on this land, as well as, they were kind of convenient. They're going to help defend the border. Eventually, Marcus Aurelius starts deciding that instead of adopting someone to be the next emperor along with him, he decides that he wants to actually maybe try to make his son become the next emperor. And so he actually starts being a joint emperor with his son Commodus. In 177, and Commodus loved fighting and loved military exercises and stuff like that, and watching the soldiers fight as he was growing up, as well as training as like a soldier almost. And so Commodus is, eager to join his father on the border of the Danube when there's a couple more tribes that end up attacking the Federati as well. And so Marcus Aurelius and his son, in 177 CE, go up to the Danube together and start fighting along the Danube together against, not the Federati, they're fighting alongside the Federati against other barbarians. Also, interestingly, barbarians is actually kind of a Roman word. Not exactly. It's always kind of one of those words that's used to kind of describe people that are kind of, I guess, lack for a better word, kind of feral almost, and not civilized and stuff. And so, one of their interesting why how it became that word was originally when people would end up speaking a different language to the Romans. How we kind of go okay, if someone's just talking and you're not really paying attention, or maybe you don't understand the language they're saying. It's kind of like blah 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 blah, BLAH. Well, back then the Romans described it as bar 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 bar. And so that's how the barbarians kind of got their name, and how the word barbarians came around. Moving on, eventually Marcus Aurelius starts getting extremely old, and he would be the last of the 5 good emperors, thanks to, basically saying that his son is going to be the next person to take over, and we're going to get to that in a minute. But before Marcus Aurelius died, and also during out almost his entire life, he loved philosophy. He was nicknamed the Philosopher Emperor at times, or the Stoic Emperor, because he heavily studied out of all the different philosophy of the Greeks. He loved to study specific ones that were known as the Stoics. And Epictetus was actually one of those philosophers he actually studied most about, and most of Epictetus's writings. And then Marcus Aurelius himself decided that he would write a philosophy book known as Meditations. It would become called Meditations, or that was its name, and it was based on the ideas of the Greek Stoics, or specifically one Greek Stoic, and that was Epictetus. And of course, Marcus Aurelius died peacefully in 180 CE. The movie Gladiator has Commodus kill him in it. Of course, that's all for Hollywood, right? That's not true at all. Okay. And so, Commodus. On to Commodus, of course, pictured here right there with Joaquin Phoenix in the movie Gladiator, as I just mentioned. He is, of course, Marcus Aurelius' son, not the actor, but the actual Commodus. And so, what did Commodus probably look like? Probably not like Joaquin Phoenix at all, from all the statues and everything. He grew out a beard, because he loved kind of the Greeks and ideas of fighting and stuff like that. And we'll talk about that in a minute. And basically, with Marcus Aurelius' son Commodus coming to power, after Marcus Aurelius chose him to, be the next heir, this ended 80 years worth of emperors chosen from their merit. The 96 to 180 CE period of just one emperor coming after another is just completely ruined. Sorry about that, went to the wrong slide there. We'll come back to Diocletian in a bit. And so Commodus right here. And so, 80 years worth of emperors being chosen from their merit. Just ruined. Because Marcus Aurelius decided, okay, my son should be able to be the next emperor. He's ready for it when I die. However, he wasn't. Commodus really never wanted to be emperor. Like, he wanted the title and he wanted the power. He just didn't want the responsibility. And there's a big difference there. And so he was more of an athlete than a leader. Yes, he loved the military and loved being in charge where military could be fighting, but he really never was even leading it himself. Other people were doing it under him. And so he loved gladiatorial games, which is why the Gladiator movie focuses on that. He also loves the chariot racing, and while he actually did fight as a gladiator, as we'll come back to in a minute, he never raced chariots himself. Yes, he would ride a chariot, like, when around the city very briefly, from, as transport, but he would never race chariots. Chariot racing itself was a very, very, very dangerous sport, and Commodus realized that could not be controlled one way or another, and so he chose never to race chariots himself in the actual race games. But he did fight as a gladiator in both the Flavian Amphitheater, aka the Colosseum, as well as, in smaller arenas elsewhere around the empire when he was traveling. He believed himself to be Hercules, kind of like, whether he believed himself to actually be Hercules himself, or just kind of like a reincarnation of Hercules, or it's the kind of same kind of idea of Hercules, it varies depending on the source. The ancient sources kind of, differ on that. But, this statue actually shows him with a club and a lion's head right here as a cloak, and that is exactly what Hercules did. He ended up using a club rather than a sword or anything for the most part in most of the Greek myth about Hercules. And when he killed a couple of the famous monsters that Hercules killed, one of them was a lion, and he wore it as basically a cloak. And so Commodus obviously liked to be pictured like Hercules. Commodus was also very cruel. He did fight and kill gladiators. Now, that is kind of, fighting for yourself, and to survive. But, he didn't necessarily have to do that, right? He didn't have to fight in the games, in the gladiatorial games, but he loved doing it. And he always won. Obviously, he was not actually killed in any of these. And now, it sometimes might have been that the gladiators were basically being paid or forced to, not be the best, fighter against him, and that it was kind of a rigged match ahead of time by either injuring or something against the gladiator before they fought Commodus. But we do know that Commodus was pretty capable at fighting in the gladiatorial games. He also fought and slaughtered animals, some of which animals, of course, probably lions and tigers and bears, You can make a bit of a joke there if you wish. But he did slaughter animals. Now, were some of these animals possibly injured or sick or, left without food for a few days or even more than that beforehand to be weakened so that Commodus had a chance? Possibly and probably. But even still, he did fight against some of these animals. Moving on, Rome actually ended up having a natural disaster in 191 with a big fire where much of the city of Rome ended up burning down, and of course Commodus had to end up building some of it back during that period in the next year. However, at this point, by then, the Praetorian Guard, as well as others, were kind of beginning conspiracies against Commodus because they really realized that he was not a good leader, and that for the past 11 or so years to 12 years, of his reign, his whole reign, he hasn't been a very good leader, and so that maybe we could get rid of him. And so the Praetorian Guard actually tried to kill him first. The Praetorian Guard themselves actually try to poison him, and they fail. Whether it was Commodus took the antidote or just realized what was happening and didn't eat the food or whatever, or take the poison one way or another, this poisoning attempt did fail. And so eventually the Praetorians ended up having to decide to do it the old-fashioned way and actually strangled Commodus one day in bed because they realized if they tried to fight him that some of them would probably get killed, and they were kind of not keen on that. They decided, okay, let's fight him, when he's asleep, and kill him then. So they strangled him while he was in bed. And immediately afterwards, the Praetorian Guard decide, okay, well, Commodus never nominated another heir, so let's sell the emperorship, sell it to the highest bidder, see if any of the senators or any of the generals around the empire want to become emperor. And with that ends the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, which had lasted all the way basically from Augustus, when it was 30-ish BCE, all the way to 192. So a huge amount of period of relative peace for the empire. There were some issues along the borders and stuff, but for the most part, it was relatively peaceful, okay? And when Commodus dies, that peace is really going to end. And so the person that ends up eventually buying the emperorship is this man, Septimus Severus. Eventually comes along and buys the emperorship about a year later, and begins the Severan dynasty in 193 CE. And so, who is Septimus Severus? Well, his name is Septimus, meaning that he was the seventh son of his father, which is one thing. He was actually from North Africa and is described as a Punic person. So a lot of people believe that he may have been or was likely very dark-skinned, either from dark skin such as, say, someone from the Middle East, or even possibly from North Africa. There could have been mixing as well there, genetically, over the generations in, as well as Roman. We're not exactly sure what he would have looked like. There's always lots of speculation when anyone ever mentions Septimus Severus is, oh, was he, very dark-skinned, or was he Caucasian, like the rest of the Latin Romans? And so it kind of does get always brought up, and so I did want to address that, but we really don't know positively one way or another. He was likely mixed, one way or another, mixed of descent, whether it was Latin and Roman, with, North African descendancy or Middle Eastern descendancy. We're not exactly sure, because remember, of course, the Punics, originally, the Carthaginians were originally from Phoenicia, right? Where, in the Middle East, right? Syria and Israel area, okay? And so, I just did want to address that because that is a common question always brought up when anyone mentions Septimus. He begins his dynasty known as the Severan dynasty because it is his family. He lived from 145 to 211 and is emperor from 193 to 211. And of course, the Severan dynasty will continue way after his death, up to 235, and we'll talk about that in a moment. He was married to a Syrian woman named Julia Domna, and Julia Domna is actually regarded as one of the most educated women in all of ancient Rome ever. Not just during the period that she was alive during, but if you look at it, look at her compared to education, compared to other women in the Roman Empire, where some of them would become quite educated, she was extremely well educated. And in fact, while Severus, or Septimus Severus, ends up going on campaign and traveling the empire, she stays in the city of Rome itself and is kind of sent letters by him, constantly telling him, tell me what's going on, and she would write back, and she ended up basically ruling for him while he was gone, and the Senate were like, okay, well, she's getting either orders from him, or is qualified to make the plans herself, and so they listened to her. It's kind of quite remarkable, kind of almost empress, but not really, right? And so, while he was also as emperor during 193 to 211, he also recodified the laws. He realized that all the different laws in the country, or the nation, or empire of Rome, were getting very convoluted, that there were just too many of them. And so he ends up actually recodifying and rewriting some of them, or has people rewrite them, and it becomes known as the Golden Laws from then on. The Golden Laws are the ones that kind of get kept, and all the rest just get scrapped. He increases the military and creates more legions, and then basically has all the different provinces led by military governors again, which was kind of how they had during the Republic, and then kind of during the Empire. Augustus and a couple of the others were worried about some kind of revolt, so it's kind of stopped that for a little while. But he starts having military governors across the empire, making a lot of the decisions for him. He ends up rebuilding part of the Antonine Wall in Britain, so he plans on going above the Hadrian Wall and reconquering more of Britain northwise. And that kind of works out very briefly, but over time it just becomes a realization by the troops in Britain that there's too much space to be guarded, and across all of Britain, and we can't guard all of it. Yes, these walls help, stopping anyone coming from the north, but what if they go around the wall, right? And so, it wasn't really a smart endeavor on Septimus's part. He and Julia Domna actually have two children together, Gaeta and Caracalla, both of them sons, and of Septimus Severus and Julia Domna. And when Septimus Severus dies, in his will, he had basically said, okay, Gaeta and Caracalla are going to rule together as emperors. The two of them are going to be able to rule together. The empire is such a big place. But as some of you that may have taken my past classes kind of realize this already, as well as some of you that might have just heard me in the past in this class, realize that whenever two brothers take the throne, it never ends well for one. And that is obvious right here, is Caracalla ends up killing Gaeta. So Gaeta is actually assassinated by his older brother. And so Caracalla becomes the sole ruler of the empire. soon after the two of them co-rule very briefly, like less than a year or so, that I know, if I remember correctly. Caracalla and a few others end up lasting for a little while, but most of the Severans end up, after Caracalla, they have several other Severans that take over, eventually ending with Alexander Severus in Germany. He was on campaign in Germany, and overseeing some of the some of the soldiers in Germany up there, in the province of Germany, when Alexander Severus is actually murdered and assassinated himself. And so, ending the Severan dynasty. And so, with the Severan dynasty being ended by basically several of the soldiers killing Severus, and they wanted to, have their leader in charge, that's exactly what ends up happening, is a military commander takes over in Germany. Well, that's going to keep on happening, because, as you can see on here, we have a period of the empire known as the Barracks emperors, where it lasts from 235 CE to 284 CE. So this large period of time where it is emperor after emperor popping up all over the empire, and it is the troops decide that they want their emperor or their leader, their military commander, to be the new emperor. And so this becomes a major crisis where who will lead when the last Severan is killed at first? Well, it's one of the generals says he's going to lead. And so some of the other generals are like, okay, sure. And then other ones are like, well, what if I want to be in command? And so the empire is just literally too big and too difficult to control. And so it's kind of like, yeah, you get to be emperor, but you're only going to be emperor of the area that you're actually at, because the rest of us military governors or military commanders are going to be doing some of the things ourselves. And then eventually they just get it into their head, I'm going to declare myself as emperor and go kill the previous one. And so we end up having army legions beginning to choose their commanders as emperors. Or really the army legion's commander says, hey, I want to be emperor. And the legion going, yeah, we can get behind that. Most of these Barracks emperors, as they become known as, become emperor. And why is it called the Barracks emperor? Well, a barracks is where the troops live. Okay, that is the name for the basically apartments or dormitories even today where troops live. And so that is why they are called the Barracks emperors, is that you've got these constant emperors coming out of the barracks, meaning former military men becoming emperor. These generals and legion commanders. Many of them never rule from Rome. Some of them end up going to Rome, basically telling the Senate and Praetorian Guard, hey, I'm the new emperor, and you have to listen to me or I'm going to kill you. And they would be like, okay. And then that general or new emperor, right, would end up leaving Italy and leaving Rome to go fight the next guy when all of a sudden he finds out someone else has proclaimed themselves as the new emperor. And so they are constantly busy fighting against their rivals across the empire. There are many, many emperors during this period of time. It's almost impossible to name them all. But in just 1 year, in just the year 238, so 3 years after Alexander Severus was killed, we end up having coins showing 8 different emperors. Which means that those emperors lasted long enough for people to basically carve their face onto a coin and then mint those coins in large numbers and spread them throughout at least one area of the empire, if not the whole empire. There could have been other emperors that ended up popping up and saying, hey, I want to be emperor, and their army goes, yes, and then they end up getting into a battle with one of the other ones and immediately are defeated. But we do have 8 at one time with coins just in the year 238. So that's up to 8. There might have been more that we don't know of, but 8 is that number right there. In the year 262, or the years 260 to 84, okay, so a 24-year period, we have about 20 claiming to be emperor. About 20 in about 24 years. So that one's actually quite a bit less here, but at this point, many of the previous ones and previous, candidates are dead. It's been 20 to 30 years of warfare between this point, between 238 and 260, about 20 years. And by the time it ends in 284, you've got basically had essentially 3 generations of civil war. Okay? This large period, almost about 50 years almost of period of time of just constant civil war across the empire. Now, who are these guys? Well, we've got a couple of them all listed here, but this isn't even all of them. Some of them, obviously, if it's an orange little one, they die in battle. Some of them end up dying from plague or disease, and some of them are even murdered by their own troops after they lose a battle. Or their own troops are like, we don't really like this guy now. He's basically saying all these things that, he's not going to pay us more, or he's not going to lead us into the correct place, and we realize that he's just full of himself or whatever other reason. And so we end up having a bunch of them end up fighting. We've got such as Trebonius Gallus dies after battling with a rival, Aemilianus. We've got Hostilian, who dies of a plague in 251. We've got Gordian number 2, which meant there was another Gordian somewhere else. Gordian number 1 is killed in battle after his Gordian the First commits suicide. So yeah, here's both Gordians. Both of them. One of them, the son, losing a battle and getting killed after his father committed suicide because, he had probably also lost battle or something like that. Maximinius Thrax is murdered by his troops. Claudius Gothicus dies of a plague. Aurelian is murdered by high-ranking Roman officers, etc. You've got all of them. We've got Gordian III possibly dying here, a third Gordian, right? Valerian dies in captivity after being captured in a battle a year beforehand. That's out on the borders of Parthia area, so it might have actually been against the Sassanid Empire. And so, which we'll talk about another time. They're kind of like what comes from the Persians eventually. And so you've got tons and tons of different emperors during this period. This map doesn't even show all of them. But eventually, one of them will take over, and we're going to come to him in just a few moments. But let's first cover the rest of the crisis of the 3rd century. So roughly, during this period of time, okay, from roughly around the same time of period when Marcus Aurelius, who rules in 180, dies, but really during, right before Commodus's reign, really, and during Severus's reign, we end up having the start of the crisis of the 3rd century. From the year 200 CE to 300 CE, an entire century of crisis and emergencies and problems. And some of it happens because of the Barracks emperors, and some of it happens because of other reasons. So let's talk a little bit about each of these 5 or major problems during this period. First is political instability across the empire. Next would be no expansion. Next, after that, would be less cultivation. Then there would be a mini ice age, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes, as well as tax collection issues. So let's just discuss each of those in a bit of, magnifying on each kind of idea. So political instability across the empire. Fighting during this period with at least 26 people claiming to be emperor. Really, it's more than that. But at some point, there is 26 of them fighting it out. It's just a huge amount of time, during this Barracks Emperor's period where all of them are fighting it out, and we've got at least 26 claiming to be emperor, but it was probably a lot more than that. Probably about maybe another dozen or 2 dozen after that. But at least 26 really were really emperor for a little while, okay, for at least a few months. And so it's, constantly fighting. And so it's, the rest of the people are like, okay, well, who's the new emperor? Okay, well, it's this guy this year, right? And then someone, like next year would be someone else would end up taking over and winning, right? Because of this political instability, the senators and stuff like that are kind of trying to make, what can happen in Rome, but they're reluctant on passing laws and changing things as well. Same with the governors in the provinces, because if someone ends up not liking one of those changes or decisions, one of those emperors could just come and kill them, right? And so you've got this political instability as well as this worry that, okay, if we do something, then someone might come and kill us because they don't like that idea, right? Also during this period, Rome kind of relied on expansion. Now, during the period of the Pax Romana, it kind of stopped expanding, okay? It would expand very small amounts, like Trajan basically conquered part of Parthia, as well as Dacia across the Danube River. But for the most part, since Augustus, expansion of the empire has kind of stopped. So there's not really been new slaves for a while, but every now and then, the Romans would end up attacking somewhere, especially like in Britain or Germany, or Parthia or Dacia, and expanding a little bit, okay? And bringing in new slaves brought into the empire. And remember, we talked about how slavery in the empire was kind of a big thing for the cycling of, products and work and stuff like that, and workers over generations, and they were the main workforce for a lot of times. Well, that's kind of stopped at this point during the Pax Romana, and especially during this crisis of the 3rd century. There's no new slaves coming in. During the Pax Romana is a less, but now it's definitely none are coming in. At this point also, without the expansion of the empire, there's no new markets to sell products to from people that actually make products on their own. Okay, if they buy or sell products, they normally now have to just sell within the empire. They're not able to sell to other countries, or other parts of the country that we're expanding into. Okay, like those other places that I mentioned already. Also, a lot of less cultivation of crops is going on during this period of time. During all the battles of the Barracks emperors, storming across from one side of the empire to the other, you end up having a lot of the troops end up going from one place to another. And they would march on the roads, of course, but would the battle take place on the road? No, it would take place in a big farming field, or in fields, rather, or grasslands and stuff. And so much of the land is destroyed and ruined due to battles. They would end up actually fighting in big fields and farm fields. And if it was during planting season, okay, well, the crops are just going to be stomped on, the little tiny crops, or right after, or, the seeds or whatever. And that might not be too bad. But if the plants are already coming out of the ground, that's going to cause issues. And if it's taking place during the fall or the summer when the plants are much bigger, that's even going to be more devastating to the crops. As well as the armies would also even take the food and the crops, sometimes before they were even finished growing, because they would just be like, okay, well, we're passing through this province, and we need army food to supply ourselves and make it to the other side of the empire, so grab as much food as you can from whoever you can. And they wouldn't pay for the food, they would normally just grab it and take it, then the farmers aren't going to be able to do anything about it, what are you going to do? Fight fight a soldier? No, probably not. And so, food was taken by the army, and then the armies would end up taking everything. And normally, they would take so much that there was nothing even to start crops with the next year, because at least when you end up taking plants from regular farmers, when they harvest all the crops, they usually take the seeds out of the crops, out of the food, and so they have something to plant next year. The armies weren't doing that. They were just taking everything. And so there's no seeds left behind for the farmers to be able to plant for the next season. As well as, in some cases, if the farmers did try to resist, the farmers would just get killed. And so sometimes there weren't even farmers left behind when the armies marched through an area. Also, most people were at this point, after 3 generations of this, most people got down to the point where it was only growing enough to survive. It was not enough to, they would take whatever they had left over, and they would be able to feed themselves and their family, which is subsistence farming, barely enough to survive farming, and not be able to give it to anyone else. And so that becomes a really big issue. Where there's just lack of food across the empire because of this less cultivation and less farming. A lot of people start beginning to starve if they're not killed in the previous fighting. There's also a mini ice age and the tax collection issues, so let's talk about them very briefly. The mini ice age is climate change. Climate changes quite frequently. Every few hundred years, the whole planet goes through either a warming period or a cooling period. It just happens. It's known science. And we know that during that period of time, during the 200s to 300s CE period, it was actually slightly colder. Now, it only changed by 1 degree. And I know you don't think that 1 degree is a big deal. But 1 degree as a global temperature change actually is quite a big deal. especially back then. Okay? Back then, it meant that, okay, maybe winter in some places ends in, say, March. Well, now, what if it only ends in April? That's roughly a month less of the growing season. We'll also say that maybe winter begins, say, in November or October in some places when it starts getting colder, and that's when you need to harvest all your crops. Okay, and they would be as big as they would be at that point before the cold would get them and make them freeze and die. But you'd have relatively large crops. Well, now, with that 1 degree change, maybe it's no longer November, October, but September, October, maybe even August in some places, northern, like, say, Germany and Britain, etc. And so, and northern Gaul, northern France. And so, we end up having that change as well. And so, not only is it about a month or so later to begin your growing season, it's a month or so earlier that you have to pick all the crops. Which means the plants that you're growing for crops are not going to be as big. You know, what if your wheat would need to, you normally harvest it when it gets to about maybe 2 feet tall or 3 feet tall. Maybe it's quite a bit significantly less than that. That's a lot less food. What if certain plants, like tomatoes, other vegetables and things, just do not grow as large because they don't have enough time before all of a sudden the cold winter sets in and kills it all. And so that's a big issue. The shorter and colder growing seasons. Plants aren't going to grow, and that's going to cause what? Even less food for the whole population, not to mention less farming beforehand, a lot less food in general because of 2 issues. And then finally, tax collection issues. Fewer taxes were collected because of all these wars. Well, no one was around to enforce the tax collection. Soldiers are being grabbed off the street and taken to go fight in a battle or a war on the far side of the province or far side of, the region or even the far side of the empire at this time. And so there's fewer taxes being collected, little to no money of tax money available to run the empire. And so whenever an emperor would take charge, they're like, okay, well, let's look into what I can build and what I can do infrastructure-wise or, whatever otherwise I want to do with my money for the empire. And then they look and they're like, oh, the treasury is empty. Or little to no money in it, so almost empty. And some of these barracks emperors, because they came from military background, would focus it onto paying the troops more, or something like that. Or even expenditures on themselves, building something like a nice statue to commemorate their victory over another guy. Not always the smartest way to spend funds. And so we end up having that issue with these tax collection issues when there is money brought in. Usually the money is being spent on bad ideas. Over time, currency in the entire empire, the sesterces and the denarii, which we've talked about beforehand, which were usually stable, have now basically become worthless. People are now worrying about what they're going to eat. Not about, oh, I can pay you 20 gold coins for that bag of beans or that bag of, wheat or whatever, for that piece of bread or something like that. No, they don't want a bunch of coins. What they want is something to fill their stomachs. And so currency almost becomes worthless. And so goods begin being traded rather than bought and sold. And it's like, oh, okay, you've got a lot of money. That's not going to do you anything. Because what you really need is some kind of product that I can eat or I can use to make my crops grow better or make sure that I actually end up having some kind of healthiness or something like that, as opposed to money, because at this point, money is just becoming worthless as a whole. Eventually, we end up having, right here, in 285, an emperor named Carinus, one of the Barracks emperors, fights a man named Diocletian in a battle at the River Margus. And at the River Margus, Diocletian's army is successful and defeats Barracks Emperor Carinus. And so we end up having Diocletian becoming emperor in 284 to 285. His army said that it was in 284, declared him as the next Barracks emperor, or one of the Barracks emperors, and he ended up going off and defeating Carinus in 285, and then finally ends up marching towards Rome from the Danube region. That's where he ended up winning against Carinus, the Danube region area. And that was roughly where he had been general as well himself, Diocletian. Diocletian reaches Rome, basically tells the Praetorian Guard and the Senate, hey, I'm going to be the next emperor. I have killed the last other Barracks emperor. And the Praetorian Guard and Senate are like, okay, sure. Because what's their choice? Well, be killed by what? Diocletian's army, right? And legions. Diocletian varied on how good he was as an emperor, and so let's talk quite a bit about him, because he's quite important. He actually rules from 284 to 305. He demanded that all people, when in his presence, call him Dominus. Dominus, which meant Lord, okay? That was what he demanded to be called. Not Emperor or Imperator or anything else. It was always Dominus, okay? Meaning Lord. He had a lot of Eastern traditions. As you can see, this statue actually has a purple tinge to it. He loved wearing purple, royal purple. And remember, purple was actually very, very rare back then. And the Romans didn't really use it. It was more of an Eastern thing, okay, that was used by Persia. And even when Rome kind of conquered the portions of Persia, under Parthia, as well as former areas under the Macedonian kingdom, or the Ptolemies, etc., they never really adopted purple as a color for the royalty or anything like that. But Diocletian did. He also lived in the East as emperor, and we'll talk about that. He actually started living out in Syria and Palestine, as well as in Greece and stuff, as opposed to Rome or Italy, and we'll talk about that in a bit. He also became treated as a religious figure while as emperor, which was different. Many of the emperors after they died, especially the best ones, were always deified, kind of like Julius Caesar was upon his death. Oh, Julius Caesar was great, and let's add him to the pantheon of gods to worship. He is now deified, is the kind of idea, that he would be worshipped as a god. But that was after they were dead. Augustus, etc., was no different. Claudius, etc. The good ones, the really good emperors were. Diocletian, however, demanded to be treated as a religious figure while he was still alive, almost. He did, however, come in, as well as being a Barracks emperor, and solving the issue of the political instability across the empire with all the fighting. He kind of ended that by killing the last other Barracks emperor. He does end up starting to change a couple things economically, to try to get things back on track, and is actually very successful at ending kind of the crisis of the 3rd century, because it kind of ends in 300, right? And he's emperor till 305, but it takes a few years of him doing this. And so what are these reforms? Well, the first is an economic reform on a land tax, where the small farmers who cannot pay and are basically forced to sell out to larger farmers. He basically has this land tax, where yes, everyone has to pay a tax. It's going to be taxes finally for the empire. And that's great. Now, is it good for the farmers? Not at all. The small farmers are not happy with this. Many of them literally cannot pay this tax, and so are forced to sell their land to large farmers. Now, Diocletian doesn't seem to care about the small guys in this situation. What he does care about is making sure that those large farmers are producing a lot of food. And so a lot of those small farmers that own small farms are now forced to work for the larger farmers. Okay? And so, as long as people are working, Diocletian and getting fed, he's happy with it. He doesn't care about the small guy losing their family farm after generations. He also puts merchants, like the actual buyers and seller merchants of stores and things, or large ones, and traders, in charge of tax collection. He says to them, as opposed to governors, you all know the people a lot better. You're going to be in charge of making sure to collect the taxes correctly or not in the certain areas. And if you don't do it, then then I'm going to take it out of your money. And so the merchants ended up doing the tax collection for it. He also freezes people in their current occupations. If your occupation was a soldier, then your son would possibly be a soldier as well. If your occupation was a farmer, then your entire family afterwards would be farmers. If you were carpenters, meaning you worked with wood and stuff like that, and carved things out of wood or built buildings or something, you would end up doing that. He basically freezes people in their current occupations and makes that generational. He says the next generation is going to do it too, and then following generations as well. He also places a ceiling on prices to stop inflation. He doesn't want the cost of goods just constantly skyrocketing and money becoming worthless. He now actually stops inflation and actually resets things to basically kind of what they were beforehand. And he says that items are not allowed to increase in price. That is that ceiling in prices. And then he also helps, and while all of this does help to improve the economy, all of these things, it does put the government fully in charge of the entire economy. Really, it's Diocletian in charge, and he's making sure that everybody's carrying it out under him. So Diocletian / the empire is in charge of the economy of the empire, and it's not really up to people and markets and stuff like that. He also goes on some military campaigns after he was emperor and become emperor. He actually goes along to Parthia, out to here, to former Parthia, and starts fighting against the Sassanid Persians. The Sassanid Persians, which are the empire that kind of took over some of the old land of the Persians, as well as some of the old Parthian kingdom as well. And he fights against them, and then he decides to make a treaty with them, and he kind of does the exact same thing with them as he does with barbarians along the Danube and Rhine River that Marcus Aurelius did with the Foederati, where he basically makes Foederati of some of the Sassanid Persians, not all of them, along the Parthia region area, as well as other barbarian tribes into Foederati along the Danube, as well as the Rhine River. Okay? Remember, at first, Marcus Aurelius did this, but only along the Danube. And not these other two places, the Rhine or the Parthian area. And so, this at first works to help defend the borders of the empire in those areas. However, over time, this actually does ruin the army of Rome. The reason why is because you've got these other people from other nations, or other, tribes or whatever, and groups, into the Roman army. And they're not really caring about Roman interests. And, over time, some of them will intermarry with Romans, but for the most part, they kind of stick to themselves and really don't care if Rome ends up getting attacked or attacked elsewhere. They only care about their own interests where they are currently living. They don't care about the greater area. And over time, training of the legionnaires, because of these groups, also becomes less, especially when it's kind of like these people helping to defend over by Parthia and these ones along the Danube and Rhine. It's just the training of the soldiers in those areas isn't up to what legionnaire quality in the past was. And that's going to cause issues later on as well. Diocletian is also known as being one of the emperors that goes after the Christians heavily. Just like Domitian and Nero beforehand, he heavily persecutes the Christians. He mostly does this in the eastern portion of the empire, so basically this area here, Egypt, etc. But he does do it a little bit elsewhere. He orders it to happen elsewhere. It was known as the Great Persecution, this period of time, and he ended up ordering soldiers to confiscate Christian books and church items, as well as destroying churches. He also arrested and interrogated the clergy, so their priests as well as even members of the church. Other members of the church, like the public that went to Christian churches, he would arrest them and have them interrogated. And the reason why he would interrogate them was to get names of other clergy members that might be now hiding elsewhere in cities and towns, and he wanted to know their names as well, or at least his agents would. And he also forbade Christians to be able to assemble in groups, so that basically they couldn't come together for church, right? He also, however, realized that the empire was too big, and so in 286 CE, he ends up setting up something called the Tetrarchy. Because again, the empire is pretty massive, as we've talked about. And so what is the Tetrarchy? The Tetrarchy is set up in 286, and it is a rule of 4 people / emperors over the empire. It's a system of government, basically, of 4 people ruling the empire. Now, how does he do it? he first decides, well, he, Diocletian, is going to be Augustus of the West. I mean, of the East, sorry. That there's going to be two emperors, two main emperors, across the empire, and they would be called Augustus. They would get the title Augustus. Okay, Augustus is no longer just the person that died 3 centuries earlier, almost, but now it is a title. Okay, meaning basically emperor. Okay, Diocletian is going to be in charge of the East, so this portion from like Greece onwards. Okay, and he ends up picking like basically his right-hand man, who's pretty good. They go way back together as knowing each other for a while, and that man is Maximian, and Maximian would be Augustus of the West. Okay, so Diocletian would be Augustus of the East, and Maximian would be Augustus of the West. And that between the two of them, they would rule over those two halves of the empire. They would each choose an emperor in training, one east, one west again, and this emperor in training title would be called Caesar. Okay, Caesar. And so Diocletian chooses a man named Galerius, and Maximian chooses a man named Constantius. Okay, and of course east and west again. And so they would end up being in charge, and we'll go to this map very quickly. Like, this is basically the west, these green portions, and then these yellow portions, okay, or yellowish tan portions, and then all these pinkish purple areas are the east, okay, so the west and the east. And so this would be Diocletian and Galerius ruling over this portion, and then Constantius as the Caesar, with Maximian as the Augustus would be in charge over here, okay? And of course, Augustus meaning the main emperor, and Caesar meaning emperor in training. Basically, if anything was happened to the Augustus of that side, this guy would be pop up here, and this guy would be pop up to here if something happened to him, is the idea, okay? The empire is also divided into 12 dioceses, which you can kind of tell here from the different portions with the little dotted lines, and 12 dioceses, and each diocese would be further divided into smaller provinces under that. And the idea, again, is that, you know, the empire is just too big. Yes, we're going to have basically 4 people controlling the empire now, you know, 2 over on this side, 2 over on this side, with really the Augustus making the full decisions on the main stuff, and then the Caesars carrying it out, and then when it's small little day-to-day stuff, the Caesars would do that too, do that for the Augustus. Each diocese would be further divided into smaller provinces, and roughly, if you take all the provinces throughout the whole empire, it's roughly about 100 of them throughout it. So several of these areas would have multiple tiny little provinces throughout these various areas. Okay, so 12 dioceses further divided into 100 provinces. And it's because the empire is just so big. Eventually, after several years of this new government style working, the Tetrarchy working, Diocletian decides to abdicate, meaning that he's going to step down and retire. Okay, and he does this in the year 305 CE. Okay, and when he decides to retire, he actually decides that he's going to retire to a little area right here and have a palace built right there on the coast of Dalmatia, right there. And it becomes presently the modern-day city of Split in the country of Croatia today, okay? But at first it was just one little palace with a couple little towns and farms in the area of nearby to basically supply food and stuff for him, as well as have some troops there to help guard him. He ends up actually abdicating there, and he forces Maximian, the other Augustus, to step down. Okay, he says, I'm retiring, and because I'm retiring, you're going to retire too. And Maximian isn't too happy about that, but is kind of forced into the issue. And so Maximian retires elsewhere, so somewhere in Italy, don't worry about that. But Maximian and Diocletian are no longer in charge, which means Galerius and Constantius are now both as the new Augustuses, and they're going to appoint new Caesars as well. So both of them now become the Augustuses, okay? Diocletian, as a matter of kind of fun, kind of little extra trivia, this is actually the pictures of the palace outside it, outside these walls here, and in the little gardens and stuff inside the palace as well as in the area around it, Diocletian himself decides to start like taking up a hobby of farming, and he actually starts farming turnips. He actually starts farming some turnips. And actually, you can kind of go to roughly where the turnip patches are around and in the palace. Although a couple of them have been kind of covered up by other buildings since, if you go there. So you might not actually be able to see the actual turnip fields that he actually tended to himself. But he did farm for a while. And Diocletian ends up dying peacefully there a few years later. He ends up actually dying in the year 311. So he actually had a 6-year-long retirement before he died from natural causes. Well, obviously, with Galerius and Constantius now as the two Augustuses and Maximian and Diocletian in retirement, what do? Well, Galerius is in charge as Augustus in the east, Constantius Augustus of the west, because those were the Caesars that they were beforehand, they just got promoted up. And each of them now leads half the empire as an Augustus. And each of them immediately, because it has to be the Tetrarchy still to keep on working, they decide to each promote someone to Caesar. Maximinius Daza is, pictured on a coin here, is promoted by Galerius, and Constantius promotes someone named Severus II, pictured on this coin. Well, the following year, Constantius dies unexpectedly. No one thought this was going to happen, but Constantius dies unexpectedly in the city of York in Britain, which actually was where my dad was born. Kind of fun fact. A personal story. But Constantius's legions, his armies in Britain, immediately say, we want this younger man named Constantine, which happened to be Constantius' illegitimate son, to be the new emperor. So Constantine is actually illegally proclaimed as the Augustus of the West, because Constantius is dead. Now, rightfully, who's supposed to be in charge? Well, that would be Severus, this man right here, Severus, on this coin. And so that's what ends up happening over on the other side of the empire, because Galerius, who's now the only Augustus legally, finds out that the other one's dead, Constantius, and so he ends up writing a letter, and he says, hey, Severus II, you're now Augustus of the West, okay? Because I'm the person that actually can promote you. What the soldiers in Britain are doing with Constantine is illegal. He's not supposed to be emperor, but you're in charge now. And so Severus II is legally Augustus of the West, but illegally Constantine is as well. And so you now have got two Augustuses of the West, Severus and Constantine. And so this is going to obviously lead to fighting in the West, okay, the western side of the empire, between Severus and Constantine, where both of them are claiming to be Augustus. Because right when Constantine's, illegitimate father's soldiers say that he's the new emperor, he's like, yeah, I'll be emperor. I'll be Augustus of the West. Yes, I'll do that. He's like, heck yeah. But is he legally to be able to be done that? No. And so Severus and he are going to start fighting. And that's when a civil war is going to begin raging in the West. And eventually, Maximian, the guy that Diocletian forced to retire, this guy right here that was forced to retire when Diocletian stepped down, decides he wants to come out of retirement. That he never really wanted to retire. Diocletian forced him into it. And so he decides, yeah, I'm going to declare myself as emperor and as an Augustus. And I'm going to be Augustus of the West as well. And beat up on Constantine and beat up on Severus II while they're fighting each other. And then Maximian's own son, Maxentius, decides that he is also wanting to be Augustus. And they basically make a deal where, yes, the two of them are going to fight against the other two, and then eventually, the two of them are going to fight against Galerius and then take over everywhere. Well, Galerius is just kind of consolidating power in the east and telling everybody settle down over there in the west, and not really able to do anything. He probably should have gone and done something, but he doesn't. Eventually, Galerius actually dies in 310, leading to a civil war now in the east, where the person that's supposed to be Caesar, elevating to the new Augustus in the east, doesn't, or does, and then another couple guys also said that they want to be Augustus. So by roughly late 310, the end of the year 310 to early 311, you have a total of about 5 Augustuses, or Augusti, as I like to call them. 5 different people fighting all throughout the entire empire, fighting for the control of the empire. wanting to be the one left over at the end. 5 different people at one point. A couple of them have come and gone by this point, being defeated. Eventually, even Maximian himself basically is defeated, and as well as Severus, and so we end up having basically Constantine marching on Rome against Maxentius, the only other remaining Augustus of the West. And I'll pick up there next time, but I do want to cover one little thing beforehand, which happens in the year prior. During this civil war amongst the Tetrarchy. And so this last bit is the Edict of Tolerations. And I'll come back to this next time as well, because it is important. But the Edict of Tolerations is issued by Constantine and Licinius, one of the guys in the east. Licinius is one of the eastern Augustuses, or Augusti. And so we end up having Licinius over here, and Constantine over here, both of them writing letters to back and forth, because while they are not Christian, they do understand that the persecution of Christians is kind of not great. Beforehand, Rome used to be very equal on any religion you wanted to worship, you could. And so, Constantine and Licinius decide that the two of them would write an edict or a law between the two of them, or an announcement stating that Christians should not be persecuted. And it is now outlawed to persecute Christians. Now, is this going to take an effect everywhere? Not right away. It's only going to affect the areas of Rome that both of them are actually in control of. When Licinius is over here, and finally defeating the others, he would end up making it law over here. But, you know, if he's only part of it up here, and not all of it, then Christians could be persecuted elsewhere, right? When he's not in charge. And same with Constantine. If he's not in charge fully, then it could happen still if he's not there to make sure it doesn't. And then finally, again, Constantine in 312 decides to march towards the city of Rome, because he's defeated all the other Augusti over here, and so marches towards Rome. He's only got one Augustus left, and that is Maxentius, the son of Maximian, who's hanging out in the city of Rome. And so we're going to talk about that conflict on Thursday, okay, in class there. And there's going to be a big battle that ends up settling this side of the West on who gets to be the remaining Augustus. Is it going to be Constantine or Maxentius? Okay, so we'll cover that on Thursday. Have a great day.